Hello, everyone. Let's welcome to the stage Frank Giraldo, professor at the University de Caldas, Colombia, and Daniel Murcia, professor at Universidad Tecnológica de Pereira, Colombia. Thank you for being here. And they are going to share with us this presentation, Language Assessment Literacy and the Professional Development of Pre-Service Language Teachers. Frank and Daniel, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for all of you who have decided to attend to this session of today. We all share this interest on language assessment. And I just wanted to clarify a bit before we begin that even though we are in the stage of productive skills, we do belong, and I think this presentation will focus a lot on language assessment literacy. Just as you see in the title, this study or presentation is entitled Language Assessment Literacy and the Professional Development of Pre-Service Language Teachers. We will be going today through this presentation in which before I begin, I want to give you some contextual notions of the whole context of this study so you have sort of an idea. This study was conducted during a curricular transition that Colombia passed through during 2017 with a national decree defined by the Ministry of Education, in which we homogenized the different titles of the different university and higher education programs in Colombia. So in the Licenciatura en Bilingüismo con énfasis en inglés, which is a bilingual program at a university, we decided to create a course that was titled Classroom Language Assessment Course. This course is developed and carried out in the 7th semester of the plan of studies of the program, which is a 16-week course with a 4 hours a week intensity, in which normally about 30 students enroll. And so far, we've been carrying out this course since 2017. Now, in order to carry out the study, we thought of the formulation of some questions, those of which are, how is language assessment literacy developing pre-service language teachers during a language assessment course? We also wanted to know which were the factors that had an impact on the course, and we wanted to derive some instructional recommendations after the study was conducted. Now, we also want to clarify that this was a pre-pandemic study in the sense that it was carried in 2017, and as we were designing the presentation, we thought that by the end of the session of today, there could be some conclusions and implications that could align with the situation that we are currently living in the world.
As we are all familiar, language assessment literacy as a concept has been solidifying. We know a little bit more than some years ago, but it is still expanding, and studies have focused on describing what this construct is about. And also researchers have been interested in specifying what knowledge, skills, and principles are necessary to do language assessment professionally, and also to describe the needs or the language assessment literacy that different people have, different stakeholders. Next slide, please, Daniel. In the case of language teachers specifically, there is a lot of research focused on describing their needs and practices and their beliefs. There is a lot of research on that describes what's going on with teachers' language assessment literacy. In terms of pre-service teachers, there is a lot of research in general assessment literacy. So pre-service teachers of content areas, there is a lot of information on that. However, and this is the gap that we have identified, there is very little research regarding pre-service language teachers, LAL. These are 2 studies in Colombia that have demonstrated that when you engage pre-service teachers in language assessment, there is a lot of improvement. If you look closely over the program for the event that we are attending this weekend, ours is the only presentation on pre-service language teachers, LAL. And in 2019, we reported that there is a lack of information regarding initiatives that involve pre-service teachers in learning about language assessment. And this is where we started to contribute to fill in the gap, which still present. Perhaps there are studies going on as we speak, but they are not reported or published yet. So this is where we come in.
So the sole purpose of the whole study was to characterize what happened to a group of pre-service English language teachers as they were engaged in a language assessment course. Now, in order to do this, we defined that this study could be conducted within two different stages. One, which is the diagnostic stage, and the following, which is the implementation stage. In the diagnostic stage, we found a population of a sample of students, of 30 students, 5 professors that were enrolled in the program at least 3 years before the study. We also found a language teacher education expert who held a PhD in education and helped us and contribute to us with all the different instruments that we're just about to present. The approach we used was a mixed method design, and the instruments that we used for the diagnostic stage were divided in quantitative and qualitative instruments. The quantitative ones were derived from the list of Fulcher 2012, in which we defined some percentages to rank the LAL topics. And in the qualitative instrument, we used the open survey, we used some interviews, and we both developed some entries in a journal. Now, as we moved into the implementation stage, we defined an action research cycle, and the instruments used were semi-structured interviews, a set of observations, some questionnaires implemented with the students, and some journal entries that we both constructed and we checked and analyzed together. As part of the analysis, we used grounded theory within the open, actual, and selective coding process in order to arrive to the nature of the impact and the factors in professional development that were somehow related with this course of language assessment. Now, we wanted to present the results of the diagnostic stage, so you have a notion of why we carried out and designed the classroom language assessment course in such way. Now, as you might see on the chart, there are the top themes and bottom themes that the students define as the important aspects they wanted to see in a course of language assessment. And as you can see, the top theme they wanted to see is the design of listening and reading assessment with a 93.3%. And the bottom theme topics they wanted to cover were language test administration and ethical considerations in language assessment with a 20%. An aspect that we want to talk about in the implications of this study. So here we have some of further notions of the findings from the diagnostic stage. Frank, would you like to introduce these three?
So we found out through collecting data from these different stakeholders that the idea of the course was to help our students or pre-service teachers to have an overall awareness of what language assessment is. What does language assessment do? How can language assessment impact their professional development or their education in the pre-service teacher program? And what are the purposes of language assessment? To do this, we collected, concluded that we needed strong theoretical foundations in language assessment that could be connected to the next point, which was central. The next point, please, Daniel. This was central in the course, as we will show you hopefully later. There had to be a lot of practice in language assessment, meaning design and test critique, so that they could use theory critically and from a very practical perspective.
Some of the other aspects that we encountered as we carried out the diagnosis was that they were very much interested in bilingualism and language policies on learning, teaching, and assessment in Colombia. As normally we think of designing a course, we don't relate it with language policies, but people believe, and all the stakeholders were very much inclined to understand what happens in Colombia in such relation, and also how washback and the impact of this washback in language assessment was conceived during the whole process of construction. So we are just going to move into the findings. within the implementation stage. This section is divided in two core sections that will come with the factors and the impact of the classroom language assessment course. And so one of the first findings we want to share with you is related with the impact of pre-service teachers LAL. And this one is related with the radical change of perception. A radical change of perception stands as we had the chance to go through the notions of the students at the beginning and at the end of the whole process. So we use questionnaires in order to understand what happened when they began and afterwards. As you see the sample of the data before the course, I thought the language assessment, the student says, was summative assessment to design a test and provide a grade. But then the student says, now I think that language assessment is a long process system that embraces a number of considerations that I have in mind, as mentioned above, principles for language assessment, for example, construct validity, to successfully measure students' proficiency level and foster improvement on their language ability. So far, what we have noticed is that this radical change, as it's also evident in the work of Arias and others and Restrepo and Jaramillo, it's so far this is a transformation of a student from a theoretical point in which the student becomes more conscientious of what happens when the theory is put into practice. Another student, as we can see, student 11 from questionnaire 2 says, before, as I was not familiar with the process of designing assessment, I thought it was just a matter of finding a test and adapting it according to the skills that were going to be assessed. Now I think that is a carefully active creating and writing an important part of assessing students' understanding of course content, their level of competency in applying what they're learning, and check what students can do with the language and their language ability. So really the functionality of assessment comes so far as the student is capable of understanding and reflecting all about it. Another finding that has to do also with the impact on pre-service teachers is the critical use of language assessment theory. And in this one, we found some data that says that while students were designing, they realized that I have found to follow the construct and the purpose of the assessment, because it's not only to give an assessment and that's it, it's also to take into account why do you do the assessment, what answers you want to collect, or what information you want to gather. Now, this became really interesting for us, mainly because when students have this notion of being part of a process of designing assessment, they have the capacity of using the theory critically and using this theory within the context they were working with.
So, just to give you a summary, two impacts. One, radical change of perception, and the other one was critical use of theory when designing assessments. So, we'll be explaining to you the factors that contributed to this overarching impact. So, the first one was the act of designing language assessments. And Daniel, please. So, we'll show you two samples, I believe. Yes. One from a questionnaire and one from a journal entry that I wrote. I forgot to tell you, I was the course instructor. So this is what the student said. When designing language assessments, I should have clear objectives and a clear construct to assess, establish a rubric, take into account the level, context, age, interest, knowledge of the students, and design a reliable language assessment. As you notice, there is a lot going on here. It was just not as they were thinking before, let's take a test and adapt it. There is a lot going on when you sit down to design an assessment. And in the journal entry that I wrote, some years ago, I wrote this. Students could show me how much thought should be put into designing a reading assessment. Among the things to consider, they highlighted. So what I did, I asked them, okay, what did you keep in mind when you were designing this reading test, I believe? So they said the construct, students' proficiency level, support for students in the test. I given examples when you design a test that support, and they told me that it is important to follow guidelines for item writing. This was a core aspect of the course. So this is something that also happened in studies. Daniel, can you go back, please, so I can do the discussion? Go back. Thank you. So in the studies that you see on the top right, Arias and others, they conducted a study and they found similar things. And this was in 2012, so that's quite a long time ago. When teachers design assessment, there's a lot going on. And in the study by Walters, he engaged teachers in doing reverse engineering specifications, and they were able to criticize standards for language learning in New York, thanks to doing hands-on work, designing language assessments or criticizing language assessments. Next, please, Daniel. And the other factors that contributed to this overarching impact were contextual factors or forces. And in the first sample that we want to show you here, it comes from a questionnaire. We asked this question directly. Has the course had any impact on your professional development as a language teacher? And this is one of the students says. It has taught me and made me aware of several aspects when designing a test. For instance, STEM considerations to avoid misunderstandings, as well as clear instructions. Besides the type of input, taking into account students' cognitive level and interest. And this was the important thing. It's not just to design a test, but to keep my learners in mind when I design that test. The other one came from an interview with a student, and she told us that she was, working for a private school, and she had to design some speaking assessment that considered her context. So she said, now I'm teaching English in a private school. In the exam and in a quiz, I implement a criteria for the speaking part. So this guided me so much in order to know what skills I'm going to assess, to follow the construct and the purpose. Notice that these themes are, they converge. What we have told you about before, the theoretical aspect is still here. These contextual forces, like the context where I do assessment, is important for my professional development, as Angela Scarino says. Next, please. And finally, the atmosphere in the classroom. And by atmosphere, we mean this. The first part is from an interview. The student said it was very useful for the three of us that designed the instruments because everyone learns something from the other. So I have one way to design something, but my partner has other way, that when you mix them, we have a good product. It was very useful to work in pairs or in trios. So as a course instructor, I had students work in teams designing assessments. So this was useful for them. And the other thing comes from an observation, the other datum. Daniel observed what I was doing, and he wrote this. Students held a discussion, and the prompting question, what was going on? It was a problematic assessment instrument. So this type of question directed the conversation of the class to make connections between the aspects dealt in class. When the connection between the factors was not explicit, I, Frank, started to make some relations to the students. For example, El Reto. El Reto is the language policy for language learning in Colombia. So I asked them, how can this be connected to El Reto? Are you using it to build the assessment or the design?
So far, we reached the conclusions and implications of the study. We'll divide them in three main conclusions. The first one derived from the diagnostic stage, in which we had the chance to have a multi-stakeholder view for planning and designing language assessment courses for these preservist teachers. Now, within the implementation, we noticed that these voices provided a lot of feedback for the content. And in terms of the impact, they decided to work mostly on knowledge and skills in LAL. And so far, the principles are a pending issue. Another conclusion is focus on the design-based language assessment course, in which we have the chance to mix the knowledge and the skills. And so far, there is a chance of doing test critique and test design, and that is a catalyst of LAL, in the sense that students or pre-service teachers are capable of analyzing and applying all the theory they've been dealing with into the context of designing.
In our diagnostic stage, we realized that people wanted to have attentions to methodologies, current methodologies for language teaching, also local assessment policies, and issues of assessment in bilingual contexts. So then we realized, my goodness, this course is going to have a lot. So it became too ambitious. So we were critical when we were implementing the course, when Daniel was observing, when we were doing our journal entries. We said there is a lot for this course. However, we wanted to address issues, at least, the pillars of the issues. For example, in the diagnostic stage, they told us, okay, we want to learn about language assessment, but what about assessment in Colombia? We call it evaluación or evaluation. That will be the translation. So what about assessment in Colombia? So we had to address that issue as well, so that we could respect stakeholders' voices from the diagnostic stage. But yeah, definitely the course became a little too ambitious. Now, the implications that we derive from our study are three major implications. Ethics and fairness, as you are probably all familiar, is mostly discussed in large-scale testing when it comes to language assessment. But we need to read and explore a little bit more the issue of ethics and fairness in classroom language assessment. So this is why we say that this is an ongoing issue. I remember that one time, I mean, it was part of a session in class, and I asked the pre-service teachers, okay, can you share experiences or anecdotes that deal with unethical or unfair practices in language assessment? And this opened Pandora's box because they share very unethical and very unfair practices from a qualitative point of view of what happens in class with these two issues. But this is definitely an ongoing issue for pre-service teachers LAL, especially in classroom contexts. When we conducted this study, it was face-to-face. Students could be close to one another. They had the materials in class. Everything was fine, you know. But in pandemic times, what we are living today, it's important to have, if you're going to deliver LAL, it's important to have a robust platform for assessment design so that people can design assessments on their own, if design is a core aspect, and at least internet access. We live in a country where we cannot take that for granted. And so if a student is ready, you are ready, and then all of a sudden internet collapses, then we have an issue. And the last implication is stakeholders' ambition. So what we're thinking is, how can we make assessment, language assessment, an underlying concern throughout the curriculum of a pre-service teacher program? If you want to have access to the article that we wrote in 2019 with the details, you can scan it here. And in that article, we also cite the article that we conducted in 2018. I mean, the article that was published in 2018 that refers to the diagnostic stage. And I believe, Daniel, we are ready for some questions, aren't we?
Yes.
Okay.
If anyone holds a question, so
feel free.
Thank you, Daniel and Frank, for such an interesting presentation. Let's see if we have any questions from the audience.
Teadira, in the meantime, do you think I have time to show people a sample of the syllabus of what we taught?
Yes, please do so.
Okay, so in that case, I need to share, Daniel.
Okay, there you go.
All right. So let me know if you can see what I'm presenting.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is like a snapshot of what happened during the course. The first 4 weeks, introductory concepts, introductory issues. We also talked about bilingualism and language assessment, ethics and fairness. And then the core of the course was what you see there highlighted, developing language assessments, design. Here in week number 9, the students had to conduct a project, small-scale project. So we would revise it in class. We would get feedback from one another. And by the end of the course, we covered policies for assessment in the Colombian context. And we even had time for a little potluck and then a final test. So that's it. That's what I wanted to show.
We do have a question.
Okay.
Yes, you do.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel, that's okay if you want to read it yourself. The question is from Aisha.
Yeah, Aisha says, how long was the assessment course for the students? So the classroom language assessment course that we've designed and implemented in the university program was a 16-week, I think it was 16 weeks course, although we consider about 17 or 18, but it's all about enrollment process and logistics, but it was 16-week classes that we defined there. And the course
Daniel, so that means 64 in-class hours, Aisha, but they also worked a lot out of class.
Like so far, the university system that we have in Colombia is like we double the amount of hours. If it's a 4-hour course, we think of it as an 8-hour course in which there are another 4 hours of autonomous work that students have to do based on the tasks and activities that are carried out inside the session.
Thank you, Isadora, for the comment. Good to see you here.
Yeah.
Any other questions, everyone?
Any other questions?
We are more than open to your questions or feedback. It's fine.
Any more questions? Well, yes, you have another one from Aisha.
Well, she said, do you plan on following up with the students' LAL during their practicum? One of the implications of this study is about the cross-curricular impact that this study had. The notion that one course of language assessment is not enough to come up with all the things that could be covered inside the frame of language assessment literacy. However, this study was shared with the curricular standards and the people and the population of the program. And so far, it has had an impact on the way that students get to their practicum. Just to give you a bit more of context, the practicum of the students begin in their 8th, 9th, and 10th semester. And this course, it's in their 7th semester. So it allows them to have a notion of how are they going to design their tests when they're faced their practicum. So even though there is not an explicit concern about LAL in their syllabus of the practicum courses, what the student does is that since it already has this backpack of elements and ideas and theoretical conceptions, they use it very often when they do their practicum. And just to share a little bit more about it, we have been aware of how the students don't just criticize their own design of tests, but also the tests they have to assume when they have to do standard testing, when they get to their schools. So really, there is some sort of a spark that comes out of a classroom language assessment course, because students become much more critical in whatever other challenges that they come ahead as they become professionals.
Daniel, I would like to add something there. Aisha, first of all, thank you for your question. When I was teaching the course, and as we told you at the beginning, the program was going through a curriculum change. So when I taught the course for the first time, we had students who were doing their practicum. And this was wonderful because they gave us feedback and they told us things that needed to be considered for when planning the course. For example, one of my students told me, okay, look, I'm having this issue in the practicum that I'm doing right now. I have problems with assigning scores, but it's not my problem, it's an institutional issue. So that gave us very insightful feedback that we can use to at least start the discussion of making the connection between the classroom language assessment course and the practicum courses. And it's an ongoing issue, and it's an important discussion that needs to be done. Thank you, Aisha.
Right, thank you very much. It's time for a short break. We'll be back at 10:30, 10:35 for our last session on this stage. Thank you, Daniela and Frank.
Thank you, Diadira. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Good luck with everything. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.